It's Sunday, June 14th. And this morning, I saw this article on Facebook that a friend had posted, and I shared with a very long and all caps, which was intentional, commentary on it. And now I want to dive into it because at the time as you could see by my what I wrote as I shared it, my brain was hurting because I was so angry. So now cooler heads somewhat have prevailed, and now I want to talk about it because I also want to talk about how some Trumpsters are somehow laying blame to Democrats, saying they've been trying to do this for years. They've been trying to destroy the country for years and the Constitution. You know what I have to say to that? Prove it. Prove that statement. Prove it. And I don't mean don't give me a source that comes from Breitbart or Fox News or National Review or the Hill. You give me a reliable source or sources to prove to me what the accusation about the Democrats have been. Prove it. I think the older I get, the more I lean to Democrat. I've been a Republican since I was 18, since I gained the right to vote. Actually, I think I was a Republican before that. But I want you to prove to me and to everybody else that the accusation you were throwing at the Democrats, don't just make a statement, throw it out there and see who's going to believe you. I know who believe you. It's the Trumpsters who have been brainwashed by Trump and his bullshit comments. Forget the fact that he was a Democrat before he even decided to disgrace our House and run for president. People forget that. In fact, 2 of his children were still registered Democrats for the New York State primary in 2016, and they weren't allowed to vote in the New York State primary because they forgot to change their political party affiliation. Which means to me that they really weren't that much they're really not that much of a Republican if that's the case. They only did it because Daddy pushed him to do it. Trump is the biggest bully of the 20th and I'm not going to say the 20th century, but of the 21st century. Yeah, of the 20th century, too. Even though he's a close second behind Adolf Hitler. I'll get to that comparison later. So, let's get to the article. Trump is threatening to subvert the Constitution. Again, this was in April. Upon reflection, I think I did remember reading about this, and I think I probably did have the same reaction that I did to this morning. Trump on Wednesday threatened to do something no president has ever done. Formally adjourn Congress, that is, end Congress's current session and force it into a recess. Mind you, in the middle of a pandemic, where Americans were dying, hospitals and medical facilities did not have access to personal protective equipment, nobody knew which end was up, in the middle of a pandemic of a virus that nobody has ever seen before. Yes, it's a coronavirus, but this one they've never seen before. So he wanted to dismantle Congress for his own purposes, his own personal reasons. Had nothing to do about the protection of the country, had nothing to do about making sure that the citizens have everything that we need to survive for however long it takes to get us through this pandemic. He did it for personal reasons, personal gain. That is, end Congress's current session and force it into a recession for the express purpose of installing his own people in federal jobs, possibly even judgeships, which they've already been doing anyway, without having to follow the normal process of Senate confirmation. Doing so would subvert America's constitutional design. He took an oath to protect, defend, and uphold the Constitution, and then immediately turned around and attacked the very Constitution he was supposed to protect, defend, and uphold. Are you getting that? Begin with the Declaration of Independence. One of the complaints leveled there against King George III was that he had dissolved representative houses repeatedly. Having witnessed that abuse, the framers did not give the president the power to force Congress into a recess whenever he wanted. Trump is attempting to do what King George did to the colonies. Are you getting that? Instead, as Alexander Hamilton explained in Federalist number 69, side note, has anybody ever read the Federalist Papers? I have the book, and I believe mine happens to be a copy of, in the original King's English, 18th century English, so it's a little bit hard to read, but I think every American should read it. If you care about this country and how the country is run, and how we got to the place we got to, with why the framers decided on the amendments and why they put the First Amendment first above the Second Amendment. There's a reason why. Guns are second. I'm a gun owner. I have a carry conceal. But just because I have it doesn't mean that I think that's the number one right that we have. Our number one right is freedom of speech, freedom to assemble in a peaceful manner, freedom of religion. Those are our freedoms. Those are paramount. Those are first for a reason. Alexander Hamilton and our framers put the First Amendment first for a reason, above all other rights. Okay. Let's read Federalist number 69. The president can only adjourn the national legislature in the single case of disagreement about the time of adjournment. It's the only time he can argue. It's about the time of the adjournment. In the middle of a global pandemic is not the time to recess Congress. Now, did they decide to recess for a short period as a whole because they wanted to take advantage? Because they were waiting to see what the CDC was going to say on social distancing, what the guidelines were going to be? Absolutely. Congress decided that, not the president. That stood in contrast with the British monarch, who could prorogue, i.e. suspend, or even dissolve the parliament for any number of reasons. The Constitution then grants the president the power to adjourn only in the narrow, tie-breaking circumstance when the House and the Senate themselves disagree on the time of adjournment. Basically, his position over Congress, as far as votes goes, to break a tie, is the same as what the vice president is in the House. passing of legislation. That makes absolute perfect sense to me. With that in mind, Trump's proposed scheme has an obvious problem. Right now, there is no relevant disagreement between the House and the Senate is holding formal sessions every few days. Senate was still working. There was no argument between the House and the Senate about adjournment. So Trump had no reason to even consider adjournment. Those formal sessions mean that the Senate is not in recess and that Trump cannot use the recess appointment power unilaterally to make appointments. This, by the way, is exactly what the Senate did to President Barack Obama's term to prevent him from making his own recess appointments. Read that again. Remember, at the time, it was a Republican Senate with a Democratic president. This, by the way, is exactly what the Senate did during President Barack Obama's term to prevent him from making his own recess appointments. And in 2014, the Supreme Court upheld the Senate's power to do that. Of course, this is all to say the president does not have the power to make recess appointments now and does not have the power to force Congress into a recess to do so. The COVID-19 pandemic is unquestionably a grave crisis, one that requires a robust and effective government purpose. But it does not give Trump the authority to override unmistakable constitutional limits. Global pandemic, when thousands of Americans are dying, when unemployment is rising exponentially, we are in lockdown. People are wondering what happens next. People were fighting over toilet paper. You really think the time is then, in the middle of all of that chaos, to suspend Congress for personal gain? Trump thrives on chaos. He loves chaos. He doesn't care what kind of reinforcement he gets. Negative reinforcement is just as good as positive reinforcement. In fact, I think he thrives on negative reinforcement even more so. Doesn't matter what he does, how horrible it is, as long as he gets attention. All this talk of adjournments and recesses may sound technical, but many important principles of constitutional law are embodied in constitutional fine print. Most obviously, a president cannot just make Congress disappear when he wishes. In order to end an oversight investigation, for instance, or to prevent Congress from voting against a war he would like to wage. He thinks that he knows how Congress is going to go, how Congress is going to vote, even though the Republicans had control of the Senate. He didn't care. He just wanted to push through anything that he wanted, and the only way he could do that was to get Congress out of the way. As for the question of staffing the government, the Supreme Court explained it in its 2014 decision that the primary method described by the Constitution for appointing officers of the United States, including the Attorney General, Supreme Court justices, and more than 1,000 other varied jobs, is presidential nomination plus Senate confirmation. He was trying to bypass Senate completely, even though Republicans held the Senate. He didn't want to have any interference for his little agenda. He was going to appoint, and he did, lobbyists that, by the way, he vowed during his campaign to drain the swamp of. Get rid of all the lobbyists, drain the swamp. And then what does he do? he backfills it with even more rats. Putting lobbyists who only have one agenda, their own, in charge of the hen house. There is a reason for that. The requirement of Senate approval, as Hamilton explained in Federalist Number 76, is an excellent check upon a spirit of favoritism in the president, and would tend greatly to preventing the appointment of unfit characters. Anybody really think Betsy DeVos is really qualified to be the Secretary of Department of Education? Does she really have the best interests of every child in the country at heart? Most of us went to public school. Obviously, some schools were better than others. Some districts were better than others. Thankfully, I think that the education that I got in the Olean, New York public school district was exceptional. Although, didn't know what I was missing, what information was not given to us at the time, and how the information that was given to us was slightly skewed. The president generally can't just cut Congress out of the picture. So what does he do? He spews resentment and untrust. He's making Democrats untrustworthy. He's saying all the Democrats are the ones that are the problem. They're stopping us from doing this. No. You know what? We need to have Democrats as well as Republicans, as well as independents, and, shudder to think, even socialists. That's how our country was founded, for everybody. Every belief system. No one belief system is more important than the other, or less important than the other. No ethnicity is more important than another. English is not we do not have a native language. Most of the world, they speaks English because that is a universal language, but that doesn't mean that the United States is an English-speaking country. There's a reason it's not in the Constitution, because we are literally a melting pot. And if we were to go to speaking the native language of the United States, then we would be speaking, and these languages wouldn't be lost, the languages of the Native American nations. Okay. But for the president to invoke the adjournment power to force a recess in the absence of any disagreements between the chambers is wholly a different matter. That would trample on the Senate's constitutional prerogatives and leave the Senate defenseless to protect itself. Now, Trump talks about the deep state, but in his definition, the deep state is anybody that speaks against him and or the Democrats. But in reality, the deep state is the Trump GOP, because they are literally attempting to dismantle our Constitution. By Trump attempting to recess Congress in the middle of a global pandemic, when Americans are dying by the hundreds at this time in April, whose purposes do you think that's going to suit? It's not going to suit our purposes. And is it really going to suit the purposes of the Republican Party? They think so, but in reality, no. The The situation might be different if the Senate was truly falling in its constitutional duty to provide advice and consent on the president's nominees, and the predicate for invoking the adjournment power was satisfied. Now, the Senate isn't necessarily failing him, but the Senate, Republican-led Senate, is failing the constituents that put those senators in office. My personal opinion. But what makes Trump's claim to an immense and unprecedented adjournment power so puzzling is that his own party holds the Senate. Not only that, the Senate has recently gotten rid of the filibuster for votes on presidential nominations, reducing the minority party's leverage in the appointment process. Now, if we, as in the United States, manages to come out of the Trump presidency unscathed, and I'm not even 100% that we're going to come out intact. Hopefully, we'll come out unscathed with a few cracks that can be fixed. Hopefully. But let's say hypothetically speaking, that that the Democrats flip the Senate. Okay? Now, McConnell has already gotten rid of the filibuster rule. Now he's lowered the standard for votes. What is it, 51, I think now, or something? So, what happens when the Democrats flip the Senate and get a Democratic president in there, and Joe Biden nominates a staunch Democrat in there to fill the Supreme, God forbid anything happens to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but if she leaves the Supreme Court, retires, or God forbid something happened to her, so Biden has the opportunity to fill that seat himself, and he finds an ultra-liberal Supreme Court justice to fill that seat, but they're not 100% qualified. Republicans can scream all they want. Democrats are going to push that candidate in because Mitch McConnell decided to lower the threshold for approval. Then the Republicans are going to be screaming, "It's not fair." Well, it was fair when you did it. So now the Democrats can now take advantage of it. So Mitch McConnell needs to be careful what he did. Be careful what you wish for. Trump has already confirmed almost as many federal judges to the courts of appeals in just over 3 years as Obama did in 8. And the majority of those judges are solely unqualified. Even the American Bar Association said that several of them were unqualified. Now, what does that say? In the entire last 2 years of Obama's presidency, 2 such judges were confirmed, and his Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, didn't even get a hearing. Trump is, of course, free to go through the normal appointment process. He would just have to persuade members of his own party to vote to confirm. But since they've lowered the threshold, it's that much easier. Justice Antonin Scalia, in concurring opinion in the 2014 case about Obama's recess appointments, did not mince words in describing what he thought the recess appointment power had become, and ignoble means of enabling the president to circumvent the Senate's role in the appointment process. Trump's current ploy is far worse. He is seeking not to exercise a power that the Constitution expressly gives him to an ignoble end, but rather to demolish and express limit the Constitution places on his power in pursuit of that ignoble end. Circumventing Congress, no crisis, not even the present one, is an excuse to do that. So, who's the deep state? Seriously, who's the deep state? You Trumpsters are accusing the Democrats of attempting to dismantle the government, dismantle the Constitution. You throw out the accusation they've been doing it for years. And yet, Trump is attacking every single sentence of the Constitution that is meaningful to we the people. Example, the First Amendment. He's attacking the free press. You know, I've said it before and I'm going to keep saying it. I look at the free press as the people's branch of government. Because without the press, we would never know what our elected officials were actually doing. And Trump calls the press the enemy of the people. But the only reason why he does is because he does not like the fact that the press reports on everything that he says, does, and tweets. He wants it to be some deep, dark secret. Don't tell everybody that I'm a con man. Don't tell everybody that I've had 19,000 plus lies since the inauguration. Don't tell anybody that. If you don't tell them, then they won't know. Just like if we don't test every American for COVID, then that means we won't have the high numbers. Are you getting that? If he says, if we don't test every American, then we won't have high numbers of deaths or confirmed cases. What you don't know won't hurt you. Does that sound logical and sane to you? We need the free press. And let me tell you, just remember, without the free press, then you Trumpsters wouldn't know what the evil Democrats were doing. You can't have it both ways. You can't attack the free press because you don't like the press that Trump is getting, and you don't like the press that Joe Biden is getting, or whatever. But the press is okay as long as it gives you positive stuff, lies about what Trump is doing and saying and tweeting. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And to me, that is just insanity. It's insanity. And I don't understand how you Trumpsters can continue to say Democrats are the enemy. No, nobody is the enemy except the people that are attacking our Constitution. And the person that's attacking the Constitution the most is the person who's supposed to be the president. Now, I've disliked him since I was 10 years old. That's 40 years. He's disgusting. He's a con man. He's a liar. He's a cheat. He breaks the law. every turn. That's how I first heard his name, because he was breaking the law. You let it go with Trump. You let him go, and you allow him to do all of these illegal things, and you turn your head away when he says, I can get away with it. I can grab a woman by the pussy and get away with it. Or I can walk out of my Trump Tower and shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and nobody would care. I could get away with it. Who in their right mind says crap like that? Seriously. And he didn't need to shoot one person on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. By lying about the COVID-19 epidemic, over 110,000 Americans are dead. You do remember that is not even that many Americans or people died during 9/11. Think about that. And everybody attacked George Bush. Trump has allowed the killing, the deaths of over 110,000 Americans. But as long as we're number one in the world in deaths, then that somehow makes it okay. Really? Only by the grace of God go I. It wasn't me or wasn't one of you that contracted COVID because you didn't follow the CDC guidelines. Is it really that difficult? Really? To put a mask on? Seriously, is it really that difficult? Is it really an infringement on your civil liberties to save yourself and your loved ones from contracting a deadly disease? Really? Is it really so bad, so hard to just stay in a group with less than 10? Is it really that difficult? Come on. My friend, my neighbor, Gloria, she had ALS. And her ALS impacted her breathing. And she was on it was sort of like a CPAP, but not a CPAP. It was a ventilator, but not really. All it did was just push air into her lungs. So it was to help her breathe. Her ALS actually impacted her diaphragm. It was paralyzing her diaphragm, so she couldn't take a breath. And she could only go so long without oxygen, and not necessarily oxygen, but the pressure to reinflate her lungs. And fundamentally, that's how she died, was she suffocated. Her diaphragm and her lungs just gave out. And while I wasn't there when she passed, as her caregiver, I would see her every single day, day in, day out, on how difficult it was for her to breathe, just to simply take a breath. And if she was too long off her ventilator, then she would literally feel like, she would tell me, she would feel like she was suffocating. Which, takes me to George Floyd. I can't breathe because somebody was literally kneeling on his neck, and then two other white officers were on his torso, pressing against his torso, restricting his ability to inflate his lungs in order to breathe. He suffocated. Nobody should live or die like that. That's horrifying. If you have asthma, how difficult is it for you to breathe when you're having an asthma attack? Think about it. But, Trump called COVID a hoax, and it was a Democratic hoax that just to, who was it? Laura Ingraham or somebody said, just another way to impeach Trump. Problem is, Trump is doing a really good job at impeaching himself. So that's all I got. But if you people are going to allow the very country you say you love to destroy, and he's destroying it, then I question your loyalty to the country. Our loyalty is to the country, is to our founders, is to our Constitution. We do not take loyalty oaths to the president. He is but a figurehead. He is not God. He was not chosen by God. He was chosen by the people. And I will never, ever choose anybody, and I don't know how anybody else could choose anybody who is so anti-American, it's not even funny. He is anti-American. He hates America, he hates Americans, and he definitely hates the Constitution because he thinks that he should live unrestricted, that he should be allowed to break any law he chooses. He should be allowed to murder anybody he chooses. He should be allowed to put a hit on anybody he chooses. He should be allowed to steal money from the mom and pop shops that actually built his businesses. He should be allowed to kick a senior citizen out of her property because her property is interfering in his project development. That also, by the way, failed miserably, didn't even get off the ground. Who does that? Good Lord, people. Wake up.